Peace by winter. This is the goal Zelenskyy announced. But immediately, a phrase followed that strikes at the very heart of the Kremlin's strategy. The president of Ukraine made it clear that diplomacy is only possible alongside tough pressure. The problem isn't just the war. The problem is Putin himself. Zelenskyy diagnosed the Kremlin, and it sounds as harsh as possible. Putin is war.
Of course, we want to end this war before winter through diplomacy. And certainly, it's very important to do so through pressure on Russia as well. But we understand who we are dealing with. Putin is war.
Ramstein has kicked off. Ukraine is receiving billions and a new military shield from the West. Kiev is accelerating. Zelenskyy has set a tough deadline. Putin is in a panic. $4 billion and a turning point on the front. Allies are sharply strengthening Ukraine. Winter will be decisive. A new military reality. Ukraine and its allies are launching a large-scale reinforcement of the front. All the details in a moment. Greetings. This is the Ukraine Today channel. I'm Andrei Silikov with the latest events. It seems the Kremlin's bet on a split in the West has failed again. Ramstein has brought Ukraine some of the most powerful news in recent weeks. Allies not only confirmed further support for Kiev, but also announced billions of dollars in new aid. Moreover, the focus is on technology and weaponry that have already proven their effectiveness on the battlefield.
Today, partners announced $4 billion in new aid for Ukraine. It's important that support is increasingly focused on areas that yield the best results on the battlefield.
According to him, the key support priorities are the Pearl program and strengthening air defense, artillery and drones. These are the areas where the partners' main decisions are focused.
About $1 billion will be allocated to the Pearl program to provide missiles for Patriot systems, which strengthen Ukrainian air defense. The largest contributions to this area were announced by Germany, Norway, the Netherlands, and Sweden. Additionally, Germany is allocating $200 million to the Jumpstart mechanism for long-term procurement of Patriot missiles.
Also, partners will direct $540 million toward the purchase of long-range artillery ammunition. Norway, Denmark, Spain, Lithuania, and Luxembourg are making significant contributions to this effort. Furthermore, allies are investing over $1 billion in unmanned systems. Great Britain will fund the purchase of 150,000 Ukrainian drones. The Netherlands will provide cruise missile drones for the defense forces, and Norway will supply maritime drones.
Partners also continue to invest in strengthening air defense, electronic warfare equipment, infantry fighting vehicles, training centers, and other critical capabilities of the defense forces.
In turn, the president of Ukraine named three main decisions from Ramstein.
Today, there are significant results in support of our country and our people. It was productive. Three key things.
First, he mentioned new contributions to the PURL program totaling over $1 billion.
This is the largest amount of support for PURL announced during the contact group meetings.
Second, support for the Czech initiative, the supply of long-range shells.
Partners have announced over $500 million in aid for this effort. Ukraine will receive some of the long-range ammunition as early as this month. We are grateful to Norway, Denmark, Luxembourg, and Spain.
Third, Zelenskyy noted contributions for the production of Ukrainian drones and missiles worth about $1 billion. For this, he thanked the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Norway. Zelenskyy set a deadline for the allies. There is no more time for long discussions. Russian missile and drone attacks are becoming more large-scale, meaning Europe and Ukraine must speed up the creation of a new shield against aerial terror. A specific time frame was given. The first tangible results should appear by this winter.
By this winter, we should already see concrete results of our joint work in the field of anti-missile defense. This is what is needed not only by Ukraine but by everyone.
This will change the war. While the Kremlin continues to count the mobilized and dream of another offensive, Ukraine seems to be betting on something else entirely. Behind the scenes of the front, a real techno-revolution is unfolding. It could fundamentally change the rules of the game. New strike systems, thousands of drones, artificial intelligence, long-range weapons, and projects that until recently were only spoken of as a distant prospect. All of this is gradually becoming a reality. Moreover, Western partners and the world's largest tech players are becoming increasingly involved in this process. Fedorov made a tough statement. If the announced plans really work at full capacity, then very difficult times may lie ahead for the Russian military machine. What exactly Ukraine is preparing and why the Kremlin is unlikely to be happy about such news, we'll find out next. The war is reaching a new level. It seems Russia is starting to lose the most important battle. The battle of technologies and resources of the future. In an exclusive interview, Mikhailo Fedorov effectively pulled back the curtain on what is happening behind the scenes of the Ukrainian defense machine today. And if you put all the facts he voiced into a single picture, a rather alarming scenario for the Kremlin emerges. Ukraine is no longer playing exclusively on the defensive. Instead, it is gradually building a system that should exhaust the Russian army, destroy its logistics, deprive it of its advantage in manpower, and move the war to a completely new technological level. The most important news was the so-called Middle Strike campaign, which is already creating serious problems for the Russian army. We are talking about systematic strikes on warehouses, command posts, supply routes, equipment accumulation sites, and logistical hubs.
In effect, Ukraine is increasingly targeting not just individual enemy units, but the entire war supply system. And the results are already starting to show. According to Fedorov, Russian logistics are severely disrupted in both the east and south of Ukraine. This is especially dangerous for the Kremlin, as a modern army can fight without many things, but not without fuel, ammunition, and communications. When supply chains begin to break down, problems very quickly reach even the most remote parts of the front. Fedorov stated that Ukraine has liberated 100 square kilometers more territory than Russia managed to occupy in the same period. For the first time in a long while, the Ukrainian side is talking not just about containing the enemy, but about regaining the initiative. This means the Russian offensive no longer looks like the relentless machine that propaganda has depicted for years. On the contrary, there are more and more signs that offensive resources are being depleted faster than the Kremlin can replenish them. Even more telling are the figures for Russian losses. According to the minister, for several months in a row, Ukraine's defense forces have been eliminating 30 to 35,000 Russian troops every month. The most unpleasant part for Moscow is that these rates are already approaching the limits of the Russian mobilization system. In effect, the Kremlin is gradually approaching a situation where recruits only compensate for losses, rather than building a reserve for new large-scale offensives. And a war of attrition becomes very dangerous for the side that is being depleted faster. But Ukraine's main bet today is drones. And the scale here is truly impressive. In the last 5 months alone, more drones have been contracted than in the entire previous year. Purchases of the first 150,000 middle strike drones are already being prepared, followed by deep strike, FPV, and other types of strike systems. In effect, Ukraine is creating a new branch of the military, capable of operating hundreds of kilometers deep into enemy-controlled territory. For Russia, this means an extremely unpleasant prospect. Fewer and fewer facilities will be safe, even far from the front line. Of particular importance is the fact that Europe is ready to fund specifically Ukrainian production. Loans and support programs are increasingly directed not toward purchasing foreign weapons, but toward producing Ukrainian missiles, Ukrainian drones, and Ukrainian long-range artillery. This fundamentally changes the situation because it's one thing to depend on external supplies and quite another to become a state that independently produces most critically important types of weaponry. Collaboration with Western tech giants is flourishing. According to Fedorov, Ukraine is already working with teams linked to Palantir Technologies, former Google CEO Eric Schmidt, and a number of other international projects. It's not just about consultations, it's about creating new interception systems, new strike complexes, and using artificial intelligence directly on the battlefield. If just a few years ago war was associated with tanks and artillery, today it increasingly resembles a technological competition of algorithms, drones, and automated control systems. Separately, it's worth paying attention to the words about Ukrainian air defense systems. Recently, the interception rate of both cruise missiles and Shaheds has significantly increased. For Russia, this is a serious problem. For years, the Kremlin has relied on massive missile attacks and kamikaze drone strikes on Ukrainian cities and critical facilities. But the more effective Ukrainian air defense becomes, the less results such strikes yield, and the more expensive each new attack becomes. The minister also spoke about missiles for the F-16. Fedorov said that nearly 100 missiles were obtained literally in emergency mode thanks to coordination with partners. This demonstrates another important trend. Ukraine is integrating deeper and deeper into the Western security system. And while previously individual decisions could take weeks or months, now many processes happen almost in real time. However, the loudest potentially revolutionary statement concerned Ukrainian ballistics. The minister directly stated that Ukrainian ballistic missiles are capable of changing the course of the war and even Ukraine's status in the world. And this is perhaps one of the most important signals of recent months. If Ukraine can establish mass production of modern ballistic systems, then objects that Russia still considers relatively safe today will come under attack. Logistics centers, warehouses, military bases, command posts, and defense industry enterprises could lose their invulnerability. No less interesting is the drone deal that Volodymyr Zelenskyy is promoting during negotiations with partners. Its essence is not just about receiving aid. Ukraine offers a 10-year strategic partnership in the field of defense technologies. In fact, Kyiv is selling not only products but also unique combat experience, which has almost no analogs in the world today, and in return receives funding, modern technologies, and new weapon systems. While Russia continues to rely on the numbers of mass mobilization and Soviet approaches to war, Ukraine relies on technology, automation, artificial intelligence, high-precision strikes, and large-scale drone production. This is no longer just a confrontation between two armies. It's a clash of two models of the future. And the most unpleasant thing for the Kremlin is that many of the announced projects are only just beginning to gain momentum. Mass drone purchases, new strike programs, the development of Ukrainian ballistics, cooperation with the world's leading tech companies, and increasingly deep integration into the Western defense system could become the factor that fundamentally changes the balance of power in the coming years. It seems the war is gradually entering a phase where victory will no longer be determined only by the number of soldiers and tanks. Victory will be determined by the ability to implement new technologies faster, adapt faster, and destroy the enemy's military machine faster. And if we evaluate Fedorov's statement from this angle, the conclusion is obvious. Ukraine is no longer preparing for survival. Ukraine is preparing for victory.
While the Kremlin was already gleefully rubbing its hands over new global crises, a completely different surprise is being prepared for Moscow at the G7 summit. Instead of fatigue with Ukraine, there's new talk of weapons, money, and even more pressure on Russia. Moreover, some events that the Kremlin had high hopes for have suddenly started working against it. It seems Russian officials will have to put the champagne aside once again. What exactly did Ukraine's allies decide? And why is Moscow unlikely to be happy about such news? Let's find out.
The G7 has struck Moscow with all its might. The partners have signed off on a new dose of strategic headache for the Kremlin. Ukraine was promised more air defense systems, more interceptor missiles, more long-range weapons, and they even declared a readiness to transfer licenses for the production of certain types of weapons directly on Ukrainian territory. And this is no longer just aid, it's the gradual transformation of Ukraine into one of Europe's key defense hubs. The phrasing about a new momentum on the battlefield sounded particularly painful for the Kremlin. The G7 leaders directly noted Ukraine's resilience and its recent successes. In effect, Western countries made it clear they see the results of the resources invested and are ready to raise the stakes. For the Russian military leadership, this means a very unpleasant prospect. If today the Russian army is already forced to spend colossal resources to overcome Ukrainian defenses, then tomorrow it will have to face even more interceptors and new capabilities for Ukrainian long-range strikes. The economic bloc of the statement also hit Moscow hard. The G7 effectively announced its readiness to tighten the sanction screws even further. Moreover, the main blow is planned to be directed at the oil and gas sector, the very foundation on which the Russian budget has rested for decades. The Kremlin has used energy resources as a geopolitical weapon against other states for years, but now it's oil and gas that are increasingly becoming its Achilles heel. Every new restriction means less revenue for the budget, less money for the war, and more problems for an economy that is already working at its limit. The promise to help Ukraine get through the next winter also deserves special attention. The G7 understands perfectly well that Russia continues to bet on strikes against energy facilities, trying to leave Ukrainians without light, heat, and a normal life. That is why the issue of energy resilience has been placed on par with military aid. In other words, the West is preparing not only to help Ukraine fight, but also to prevent the Kremlin from achieving its goals through the terror of the civilian population. And the bad news for the Kremlin didn't end there. According to Politico, a much more interesting setup for Ukraine began to emerge behind the scenes of the negotiations than could have been expected just a few months ago. Donald Trump, who was long perceived in Moscow as almost the main hope for weakening Western support for Kyiv, suddenly found himself in a situation where he needs the help of allies himself. And this is where the most interesting part begins. After the escalation of the situation around Iran and the risks to shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, the White House is interested in the support of European allies. Without partners, ensuring the stability of one of the world's most vital maritime routes will be extremely difficult. According to diplomatic sources, the summit has effectively begun discussing the principle of quid pro quo. Europe is helping Washington resolve security issues in the Middle East, and in return, the United States is taking a tougher stance toward Russia and continuing to support Ukraine. The situation for the Kremlin looks almost comical. For years, Russian propaganda convinced everyone that as soon as Trump returned to big politics, the Western front of support for Ukraine would begin to crumble before their eyes. But instead, a completely different picture is emerging. Due to the crisis surrounding Iran and the need to guarantee the security of world trade, Washington increasingly needs allies. And allies, as it turns out, have their own demands regarding Ukraine. Concrete support for Ukraine is expected from Trump, and that is exactly the signal he reportedly gave to the leaders of the G7 countries. If these agreements actually begin to be implemented in practice, it will result in a very unpleasant paradox for Moscow. The geopolitical crisis in the Middle East, which was supposed to distract the world's attention from Ukraine, may instead push Washington toward new steps in support of Kiev. And while champagne was likely already being opened in Kremlin offices due to the new crisis in the Persian Gulf region, reality once again proved to be much more complex. World politics loves cruel jokes. The fire that was supposed to distract everyone from Ukraine suddenly becomes another argument for arming it more, pressuring Russia harder and strengthening cooperation between Washington and European capitals. Meanwhile, Trump has managed to speak with Zelenskyy. The leaders discussed how to finally defeat Russia in this war. Moreover, the US president immediately announced new meetings and consultations. While Russian propaganda has for years dreamed of a split between Kyiv and Washington, on the sidelines of the summit, the US and Ukraine are increasingly coordinating their actions, and the Kremlin risks finding itself in the role of an observer without a vote. A closed-door meeting between Trump, Zelenskyy, and Macron drew special attention. Behind closed doors, politicians gathered whose decisions today determine the security of all of Europe. And the rhetoric was quite tough. Trump made it clear, the war has already dragged on and the cost for all parties continues to rise. The most interesting thing is that key discussions about the future of the war are taking place between Ukraine's allies, while Russia is increasingly left outside these negotiation rooms. For the Kremlin, this is perhaps the most painful moment of the entire summit. The G7 has effectively turned into a headquarters where the future of the war, new sanctions, weapons for Ukraine, and further pressure on Moscow are discussed. At the table are Ukraine, the US, and European allies, while Russia increasingly resembles the object of these decisions rather than their author. The irony of fate is that Moscow started the war expecting to dictate its terms to the world, and now the world increasingly gathers without it and decides what to do next. Ukraine receives a signal, support will continue and may even intensify. Russia, meanwhile, understands the calculation on the exhaustion of the West is not working. Furthermore, instead of the long-awaited fatigue of the Allies, the Kremlin risks facing a situation where the Ukrainian army becomes even stronger, the Ukrainian defense industry even more powerful, and the economic pressure on Russia even more painful. And it seems that for many in the Kremlin, this could turn out to be much worse news than any statements from the front.
Putin has played himself. A fuel crisis has swept across all of Russia. The problems have already reached the very heart of the RF. And the events of recent weeks increasingly resemble the beginning of a major systemic failure. A country that for years boasted of its oil wealth has suddenly faced something it was not prepared for. The myth of Russia's inexhaustible resources is literally evaporating before our eyes. What is really happening with Russian fuel? Why are alarm bells already ringing from different corners of the Russian Federation? And how is the war that the Kremlin planned to wage against others hitting Russia itself ever more painfully? We'll tell you now.
Putin's war has backfired. The fuel crisis has reached the very heart of Russia. Moscow and St. Petersburg. In a country that for decades called itself an energy superpower, gas stations have suddenly started introducing limits on gasoline and diesel. Now, fuel is being dispensed almost like a scarce commodity, no more than 20 liters of gasoline and 40 liters of diesel per person. The irony of the situation is that this is happening not somewhere in the hinterlands, but in the country's two main cities. The reaction of officials looks even more interesting. The authorities traditionally assure that there is no shortage and that there are enough reserves. However, if fuel is truly in abundance, then why limit its sale? It seems the Russian bureaucracy has once again invented its own version of reality, where emptying reservoirs are called stable supplies and limits at gas stations, an absence of problems. Just recently, Russian propaganda was mocking Ukrainian fuel lines. Now, similar problems are sweeping across Russia itself, from Moscow and Petersburg to Rostov, Kazan, Kursk, and Volgograd. And while the Kremlin continues to talk about the strength of its economy, in practice, a country with some of the largest oil reserves in the world is suddenly starting to save gasoline. It seems the main enemy of the Russian fuel industry is no longer sanctions, but the consequences of its own war. The problems have also reached Tatarstan, one of Russia's key oil regions, which ranks second in oil production and is among the leaders in its refining. There, drones struck the Tanako and Taifen-K oil refineries. It is from there that the country's fuel market is largely supplied. Therefore, when difficulties begin in the very heart of Russian oil refining, it is not surprising that the consequences quickly reach even Moscow and St. Petersburg. It turns out to be quite awkward. Strikes are heard hundreds of kilometers from the capital, yet gasoline restrictions are already being introduced near the Kremlin. The behavior of the oil giants themselves adds a special touch of comedy to the situation. Until recently, they were assuring that there were no problems and talk of a shortage, without exaggeration. But reality proved stubborn. First, restrictions appeared in the Moscow region, then in New Moscow, and now they've reached the country's largest cities. It seems the Russian authorities are trying to convince the public there's no fire, while they themselves run around the house with buckets. The regions that are supposed to feed the entire country have also suffered. In the Irkutsk region, farmers are already openly talking about the threat of bankruptcy. There's a diesel shortage, prices have soared to record levels, and sowing work is simply stopping in some places. The Buretskoye farm has already been forced to suspend its campaign due to a lack of fuel. What a turn of events. An energy superpower cannot even refuel its own tractors. The problem has become so serious that local farmers are being told to refuel heavy agricultural machinery at regular gas stations. It sounds almost like a joke, but these are exactly the ideas officials are proposing now. However, farmers can only throw up their hands in frustration. Huge combines and tractors physically cannot operate under such schemes. While officials invent new ways to fight reality, diesel fuel has nearly doubled in price since February, exceeding 100,000 rubles per ton. And the most interesting thing is that this is no longer just a local story. Diesel shortages and fuel sales restrictions are being recorded in at least 25 regions of Russia. Krasnoyarsk Krai, Rostov region, Krasnodar Krai, the list is constantly growing. Farmers complain they can't buy fuel even at sky-high prices, and delivery times have turned into a real lottery. While the Kremlin spends colossal resources on the war, its own agricultural sector is beginning to suffocate from a resource deficit. However, while fuel limits are just starting in Russia, the situation in occupied Crimea looks significantly bleaker. There, gasoline is gradually turning into a strategic resource. Local residents stand in lines at gas stations for hours, but even that doesn't guarantee success. Because as soon as a fuel truck arrives at a station, the Russian military often gets access to the fuel first. The army, which supposedly fully controls the peninsula, is now taking resources before the civilian population. Against this backdrop, what usually accompanies any shortage is starting to flourish in Crimea, the black market. Fuel is resold through intermediaries or even directly from tankers, but at 2 to 3 times the official price. It seems the peninsula is gradually returning to the wild 90s, when goods could only be found through connections and for much more money. Most tellingly, the occupation authorities are already forced to introduce strict control measures. A QR code system has appeared in Sevastopol, and a limit of just 20 liters of fuel per day is set for each car. Inspectors and officials are stationed near gas stations to ensure that drivers do not buy gasoline more than once. The irony is that all this is happening in a territory the Kremlin has showcased for years as a window of its successful integration. The cause of these problems is becoming increasingly obvious. After a series of strikes on military logistics and fuel infrastructure, the occupiers can no longer rely on previous stockpiles. Every strike on logistics, every damaged route, and every supply disruption is almost instantly reflected in lines at gas stations. It seems the fuel crisis, which began as a local problem, is gradually turning into another major headache for the Kremlin. The most unpleasant thing for Russia is that this no longer looks like a temporary glitch. If a country calling itself an energy superpower is forced to ration gasoline sales, a logical question arises: what's next? It seems Ukrainian strikes are increasingly hitting not just individual plants, but the very myth of Russia's inexhaustible resources. And this myth is starting to melt faster than gasoline is disappearing from Russian gas stations.
And what do you think about the latest events? Write to me in the comments, leave a like, and stay up to date with the main news. There's more to come.